welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Look, I need to tell you something before we start. After reading these 6 stories from Appalachia, I couldn't sleep for 2 nights. Because here's the thing, mountains don't just sit there. Something lives in them. Something that's been there way longer than us. And it doesn't like visitors. Real quick, subscribe, hit like, and comment where you're from. I read every single one. Alright, one warning though. After this, you might never look at forests the same way. Ready? Here we go. I'm Nicole Davis, and I'd been driving school bus for Jefferson County for about 8 years when they handed me what looked like the easiest route assignment of my career. At 27, I thought I'd seen everything these mountain roads could throw at me. Ice storms that turned curves into skating rinks, fog so thick you couldn't see the hood ornament, kids who thought it was funny to hide the stop signs. But this new route, through the Blackwater Falls area, it was supposed to be simple. Just a handful of kids from the remote mountain communities, good kids from families who'd lived in these hollers for generations. The supervisor even smiled when he gave me the paperwork, said I'd earned myself a break from the chaos of the main routes through town. Looking back now, 3 years later, I think that smile should have been my first warning. Nobody in Jefferson County transportation smiles when they're doing you a favor. But I was tired of dealing with city traffic and kids who thought throwing things at the windshield was entertainment, so I took the route without asking many questions. Sometimes I wonder if they knew what was happening out there. Sometimes I wonder if that's exactly why they needed someone new. The route itself covered about 40 miles of winding mountain roads, picking up maybe 15 kids total from scattered houses and trailer parks tucked back in the hollers, where the old-growth forest still grew thick enough to block out the sun even at noon. These weren't the suburban neighborhoods with matching mailboxes and HOA regulations. These were places where families had been living since before West Virginia was even a state, where the roads were still dirt until the 1,970 seconds, and where people measured distance by how long it took to walk somewhere rather than miles on a map. My first week went exactly like I'd hoped it would. The kids were polite, quiet, the kind who said yes ma'am and thank you without being reminded. They knew their stops, had their backpacks ready, climbed on and off the bus without drama. The parents I met during pickup and drop-off were friendly enough, though they had that particular mountain reserve that comes from living in places where your nearest neighbor might be 2 miles away, and privacy isn't just preferred, it's essential for survival. The landscape was beautiful in that raw, untouched way that makes you understand why people fight so hard to keep developers out of these mountains. Ancient oak and maple trees formed tunnels over the narrow roads, their branches so thick that even on sunny days, the bus headlights stayed on. Creek beds carved deep channels alongside the asphalt, and every turn revealed another vista of rolling hills that seemed to stretch forever into the distance. The kids would point out landmarks as we drove. That's where my granddaddy's still is. Or see that big rock? There's caves behind it that go all the way to the next county. I settled into the routine quickly. Morning pickup started at 6:30 a.m. sharp, winding through the hollers as the mist still clung to the creek beds. Afternoon drop-off began around 3:45, when the light was already starting to slant golden through the trees. The bus itself was an older model, but it ran smooth, and the radio worked fine for staying in contact with dispatch. My GPS unit had decent reception most of the time, though there were dead zones where the mountains blocked the satellite signal. Nothing unusual for rural routes. It was the second Monday when I first noticed something was off. I'd driven the same route every day for a week, memorized every curve and straightaway, knew exactly where the steep climbs were and which turns came up faster than they looked. But that morning, pulling out of the transportation depot with my coffee still steaming in the cup holder, something felt wrong the moment I reached the edge of the route area. The road signs were different. Not new signs, not like someone had come through and updated the mileage or speed limits. The same physical signs, with the same weather stains and bullet holes that every rural sign in West Virginia eventually acquires, but they were facing the wrong directions. The sign that had pointed left toward Holbrook Hollow for the entire previous week was now pointing right. The mile marker that had read 18 was now 23. The speed limit sign coming out of the first curve, which had been 35 miles per hour, now read 25. I slowed down, staring at that speed limit sign like it might change back if I looked at it long enough. The yellow paint was faded in exactly the same places. The post had the same rust stains, but the number was definitely different. I'd made a mental note of it the previous Friday because 35 had seemed fast for that particular curve, and now it read 25. When I picked up the first group of kids, the Morrison children from the old farmhouse at the end of Kettle Creek Road, I asked them about it. "Hey, was there road work around here over the weekend? The signs look different." The oldest Morrison kid, a quiet 13-year-old named Danny, just shrugged. "Roads change sometimes. Daddy says the county's always moving things around." The other kids nodded like this was perfectly normal, like municipal road departments regularly spent their weekends playing musical chairs with traffic signs for no apparent reason. I figured maybe there had been maintenance I hadn't heard about, maybe someone had decided the speed limits needed adjusting after some kind of safety review. By Wednesday, it wasn't just the signs anymore. The entire road layout had changed. Curves that had turned left the previous week now went right. Hills that had been steep climbs requiring a downshift were now gentle slopes the bus could take in third gear without straining. The distance between stops had shifted. Some that had been close together were now farther apart. Others that had required a longer drive were suddenly just around the next bend. But the strangest part was that the kids still knew exactly where their stops were. Even though the roads had changed, even though the landscape looked different, they'd tell me to stop at precisely the right moment. And there would be their house or trailer, sitting exactly where it was supposed to be, as if the buildings themselves had moved to accommodate the new road layout. I started paying closer attention to my surroundings, making mental notes, even taking a few pictures with my phone during lunch break. By Friday of that second week, I had photo evidence that the route was changing daily. Not small changes, not things you might miss or remember wrong. Major alterations to the physical landscape that should have been impossible. That's when my GPS stopped working entirely. The device would power on, connect to satellites, show a clear signal, but according to the screen, I was driving through empty space. No roads, no landmarks, nothing but blank terrain where the route obviously existed. I was clearly driving on asphalt, following painted yellow lines, passing road signs and mailboxes, but the GPS showed only wilderness. The radio started picking up stations that didn't exist. Weather reports for cities I'd never heard of. News broadcasts discussing local events in places that weren't on any map I could find. When I mentioned it to the kids, they said their phones never worked in the shifting zone anyway, like that was just an accepted fact of life out here. "The what zone?" I asked. "That's what Granddaddy calls it," said Emma, a 10-year-old with pigtails who lived in the last trailer on Birch Creek Road. "Says the mountains move around here sometimes. Always have. Phone towers can't keep up." By the third week, I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. The landscape itself was changing now, not just the roads. Mountains appeared in different positions from day to day. Valleys existed where hills had been the morning before. Some of the houses I'd been stopping at for 2 weeks were simply gone, replaced by empty lots with different mailboxes. But somehow, new kids would be waiting at those spots, kids who looked familiar but whose names I couldn't quite remember. I tried talking to the parents about it during pickup, asking casually if they'd noticed anything unusual about the area lately. They looked at me like I was confused, insisting that everything had always been this way, and maybe I was thinking of a different route. But I had photographs on my phone showing the same locations, looking completely different from one day to the next. When I showed the pictures to Mrs. Hensley, whose twin boys caught the bus near the old mining road, she stared at them for a long moment before handing my phone back. "That's not around here," she said firmly. "Must be somewhere else you drove through." This hollows looked the same since my great-grandmother was a girl, but I knew it was the same spot. I recognized the distinctive lightning-struck oak tree in the background, the shape of the mountain ridge, the angle of the power lines. Something was changing both the physical world and people's memories of it, leaving me as the only person who remembered what things had looked like before. That's when I saw it happening in real time. I was driving the morning route, approaching the steepest climb near what the kids called Devil's Backbone Ridge, when I noticed a large shadow moving across the mountainside ahead of me. At first, I thought it was just a cloud passing overhead, but the shadow was wrong. Too dark, too defined, moving in a pattern that didn't match the wind direction. Wherever the shadow touched, the terrain shifted. Trees moved to new positions, rocks rearranged themselves, Entire sections of mountainside flowed like liquid and reformed into different shapes. The road itself bent and curved to accommodate the changes, yellow lines repainting themselves as I watched. Asphalt flowing like thick honey to create new curves and grades. I stopped the bus and sat there with my mouth hanging open, watching geography rearrange itself like someone was molding clay. The kids didn't even look up from their conversations or their handheld games. This was apparently so normal to them that it wasn't worth noticing. The shadow belonged to something flying overhead, something massive but almost impossible to see clearly. It was like looking at heat distortion on summer pavement, a presence that bent light around it without quite being invisible. When it passed directly over the bus, I felt a moment of weightlessness, like we'd gone over the peak of a steep hill at high speed, but we were sitting perfectly still. "What is that thing?" I whispered, not really expecting an answer. Danny Morrison, who was sitting in the front seat that day, looked up from his book and glanced out the windshield with mild interest. "Oh, that's just the mountain keeper," he said, like he was identifying a particularly common bird. "Daddy says it's been here longer than people. Keeps things tidy." "Tidy? You know, arranges stuff, makes sure everything fits right." He went back to his book. "Roads used to be pretty bumpy before it started helping out." I sat there for another few minutes, watching the shadow finish its pass over the ridge ahead of us. Where it had touched, the steep rocky climb that had been giving the bus trouble all week was now a gentle, sweeping curve that looked like it had been professionally engineered for school bus traffic. The thing, whatever Danny had called the mountain keeper, was terraforming the landscape to make my route easier. But why? And what else was it changing? Over the next few days, I started noticing the pattern more clearly. The entity would pass over areas where I'd had difficulty the previous day, smoothing out problems, rerouting around obstacles, adjusting the terrain to make the bus route more efficient. It was like having a supernatural road crew that worked overnight to fix every complaint I might have had about the driving conditions. The problem was that it was also changing everything else. The families I picked up weren't quite the same from day to day. Oh, they looked similar, had the same general names and lived in approximately the same places, but details were different. Mrs. Chen, who had been very pregnant on Monday, had somehow already given birth by Wednesday, but she couldn't remember when or where. The Jefferson boy, who had gotten on the bus with a cast on his arm one morning, was whole and healthy the next day, with no memory of ever being injured. People's histories were being edited along with the landscape. I realized I was the only one who noticed because I came from outside the affected area. Every night, I drove home to my apartment in town, 20 miles away from whatever range this entity operated in. My memory stayed intact because I wasn't there when it made its adjustments. But everyone who lived within the shifting zone was having their past rewritten along with their environment. The entity was turning the mountains into something that defied physics, a place where reality was more like a rough draft that could be edited and improved upon. And the local families had adapted to it, evolved to live with constant change so seamlessly that they didn't even retain conscious memories of what things had been like before each modification. It should have been terrifying, but honestly, it was almost beautiful. The landscape was becoming more perfect every day, more scenic, more functional, better suited for the people living there. Roads that curved exactly right, hills that provided perfect windbreaks for houses, streams that flowed where they were needed most. But I was starting to feel my own memories getting fuzzy around the edges. On my final day driving that route, I woke up and couldn't quite remember what my apartment looked like. I knew I lived somewhere in town, knew I had to drive a certain direction to get to work, but the details were sliding away from me like water through my fingers. The bus route itself had become a straight line, not curved around the mountains, not following the natural contours of the land, just a perfectly straight road that led from the depot into the heart of the shifting zone and back again. It defied every principle of Appalachian road construction, ignored completely the steep terrain it was somehow built through. At the end of the line, where I'd normally turn around at the last bus stop, there was something waiting for me. I can't describe it properly because it existed in too many dimensions for my brain to process completely, but it was aware of me in the same way I was aware of it. Massive presence that bent reality around itself like liquid, reshaping the fundamental structure of space and time with the casual ease of someone rearranging furniture. I could feel my memories starting to change, my recollection of the original landscape fading like old photographs left in sunlight. The entity wasn't malicious. It was trying to help, trying to make everything perfect for the people living under its protection. But perfection apparently required forgetting that things had ever been different. I put the bus in reverse and backed away as fast as I dared on that impossible straight road. When I reached the depot that afternoon, I walked directly to the supervisor's office and requested a transfer to any other route in the system. When he asked why, I just said the mountain route was too dangerous for regular service. I didn't explain about reality-bending entities or terraformed landscapes or families whose memories were rewritten nightly. I just said it was dangerous and left it at that. He reassigned me to the middle school run through downtown Jefferson, dealing with urban kids and traffic lights and all the normal chaos I'd been trying to escape. It was a relief to work in a place where the roads stayed put and the stop signs pointed in consistent directions and gravity worked the same way every day. Sometimes I dream about those impossible mountains that bend like water, about roads that straighten themselves overnight, and families who adapt so completely to change that they forget it's happening. I wonder if those kids are still taking the bus through a landscape that doesn't exist on any map, riding through valleys that reshape themselves to be more beautiful and useful with each passing day. And sometimes, when I'm driving the regular routes through town, I catch myself wishing my roads could be improved by something that cared enough to make them perfect. But then I remember the feeling of my own memories slipping away, and I'm grateful for imperfect asphalt and traffic signs that never move, and mountains that stay exactly where they're supposed to be. My name's Ashley Parker, and I was 24 when everything I thought I knew about being alone in the woods got turned upside down. I'd been working as a veterinary assistant at a small clinic in Martinsburg, West Virginia, for about 2 years, mostly dealing with farm animals and the occasional family pet. It wasn't glamorous work, but I loved animals, and the pay was decent enough to keep my little apartment and my beat-up Honda running. The thing about working with animals is that you learn to read signs, body language, subtle changes in behavior, when something's just not right, even if you can't put your finger on why. Animals don't lie or try to hide when they're scared or hurt. They just are what they are. I guess that's why what happened to me in Lost River Gorge hit so hard. Because every instinct I'd developed working with frightened animals started screaming at me, and I almost didn't listen. It was early October when my relationship with Marcus fell apart. We'd been together for 3 years, living together for 1, and I thought we were heading towards something permanent. Turns out he'd been thinking about someone else entirely, specifically his coworker Jessica, who had a laugh that made him feel alive again. His words, not mine. The whole thing imploded over the course of a weekend, and by Monday morning, I was sleeping on my friend Sarah's couch and trying to figure out how to untangle 3 years of shared everything. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal, though that cut deep enough. It was how small and suffocating Martinsburg suddenly felt. Everywhere I went, I'd see his truck or think I glimpsed him in a store window. The coffee shop where we used to go for Sunday breakfast, the little park where he'd taught me to throw a frisbee properly, even the grocery store. Everything had his fingerprints on it. I needed to get away from all of it, somewhere I could breathe again and remember who I was before I became half of Ashley and Marcus. That's when I remembered Lost River Gorge. My dad had taken me camping there when I was maybe 12, back when he was still trying to bond with me after the divorce. It was about an hour-and-a-half drive from Martinsburg, deep enough in the mountains that cell service was spotty at best. I remembered it being beautiful in a wild, untouched way, all old-growth forest and rocky outcroppings, with a river that ran clear and cold even in summer. Most importantly, I remembered it being empty, the kind of place where you could camp for days without seeing another person. I'd never gone camping alone before. Marcus had always insisted it wasn't safe for a woman to be out in the wilderness by herself, which looking back was probably more about control than concern. But I had a good tent, a camp stove that actually worked, and enough stubborn pride to prove to myself that I didn't need anyone's permission to exist in the world. I loaded up my Honda with everything I thought I'd need for 4 days, told Sarah where I was going, and headed into the mountains. The drive up was exactly what I needed. With each mile of winding mountain road, I felt the knot in my chest loosening a little. The trees were just starting to turn, splashes of red and gold against the dark green of the pines. By the time I reached the turnoff for Lost River Gorge, I was actually humming along to the radio for the first time in weeks. I found a perfect spot about 15 miles from any real road, accessible only by a narrow dirt track that my little Honda barely managed to navigate. It was a small clearing surrounded by massive oaks and maples, with a ring of stones that showed someone had camped there before, though not recently. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves, and I could hear the river running somewhere below through the trees. It felt like stepping into a different world, one where Marcus and Jessica and all the mess I'd left behind simply didn't exist. Setting up camp took longer than I expected. Apparently Marcus had been doing more of the actual work than I'd realized. But by evening, I had my tent pitched, a decent fire going, and a can of chili warming on my camp stove. The silence was incredible. Not empty silence, but the kind that's full of small sounds. Leaves rustling, the distant murmur of water over rocks, the occasional crack of settling branches. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could actually breathe. I slept better that first night than I had since the breakup. No traffic noise, no neighbors through thin apartment walls, no phantom sounds that might be Marcus's key in the lock. Just the steady whisper of wind through leaves and the far-off call of what might have been an owl. When I woke up, sunlight was filtering through the tent walls, and everything felt possible again. That's why the stone cairns were such a shock. I unzipped my tent that second morning and immediately knew something was different. 7 stone stacks stood in a perfect circle around my campsite, each one about knee-high and balanced with the kind of precision that takes time and patience. Each stack had something resting on top. A piece of bark here, a small white bone there, a smooth pebble that caught the morning light. They definitely hadn't been there when I went to sleep. My first thought was that other campers were playing some kind of game. Maybe it was a local tradition I didn't know about, like those painted rocks people leave on hiking trails. The stones looked deliberately placed but harmless, even kind of artistic in their own way. I walked the circle, examining each cairn. The bones looked like they came from small animals, maybe rabbits or squirrels that had died naturally. The bark pieces were carved with simple patterns, nothing threatening. But as I stood there with my morning coffee, trying to convince myself it was just friendly wilderness art, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being evaluated. You know how animals will sometimes freeze and watch you when they're trying to decide if you're a threat? That feeling of being studied, measured, catalogued? That's what the clearing felt like now. Like something had spent the night taking my measure and marking its conclusions in stone. I left the cairns alone and went about my day. Made breakfast, read a book by the river, took a long hike through the woods. The forest was beautiful, all golden light and autumn colors, and by afternoon I'd almost forgotten about the mysterious stone stacks. Almost. That's when the silence started. It happened around 3 o'clock, sudden as a switch being flipped. One moment the woods were full of the normal sounds of afternoon, birds calling, insects buzzing, squirrels chattering in the branches, and the next moment, nothing. Complete, absolute silence that made my ears ring. The air got thick and heavy, like the pressure drop before a thunderstorm, though the sky was clear. I caught a whiff of something metallic underneath the usual smell of rotting leaves, sharp and unpleasant. The hair on my arms stood up. Not metaphorically, literally stood up, like there was static electricity in the air. And underneath it all was that feeling again, stronger now. The sensation of being watched, studied, measured by something just out of sight. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line around my clearing. Nothing, just dark spaces between the trunks where anything could be hiding. The rational part of my brain said it was probably just wildlife going quiet because of a predator in the area. A bear maybe, or a big cat. Mountain lions weren't common in West Virginia, but they weren't impossible either. The irrational part of my brain, the part that had learned to read animal fear signals, was screaming that whatever was watching me wasn't natural. The silence lasted maybe 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the normal sounds of the forest returned. Birds began calling again. Insects resumed their buzzing, and the pressure in the air lifted. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. That I'd been marked somehow. That evening, I found the red cloth strips. They were tied to branches in a rough circle around my campsite, each one about shoulder height, each one knotted with the same precise, tight binding. The fabric looked old and faded, like it had been weathered by many seasons, but the knots were fresh. Someone, or something, had marked my territory while I was hiking. Now I knew for certain that this wasn't random camper art or friendly forest traditions. Someone was deliberately marking my campsite, my presence, maybe even me. The question was why, and whether I should pack up and leave immediately or tough it out for the remaining 2 days I'd planned. Pride won out over common sense. I'd come here to prove I could handle being on my own, and running away at the first sign of weird behavior would feel too much like admitting Marcus had been right about me needing protection. I built a bigger fire that night, kept my hunting knife within easy reach, and told myself I was being paranoid. I should have listened to the paranoia. I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of rhythmic tapping on the trees around my campsite. Slow, deliberate, like someone was sending Morse code with a stick or small hammer. The pattern was complex. 3 quick taps, pause, 2 slow taps, pause, 5 quick ones, repeat. It moved in a circle around my tent, always just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam when I tried to track it. The tapping went on for 2 hours. I lay in my sleeping bag, knife in hand, listening to whatever was out there methodically working its way around my camp. Every time I thought it had stopped, it would start up again from a different direction. I never saw what was making the noise, despite sweeping my flashlight toward the sound whenever it started. Whatever was out there was staying just beyond the light, just out of sight, but making sure I knew it was there. When dawn finally started to break, the tapping stopped as abruptly as it had begun. I dozed fitfully for another hour before giving up on sleep altogether and crawling out of my tent to assess the damage. That's when I found the handprints. They were pressed into the soft mud around my tent, dozens of them, like someone had been crawling around my campsite in the dark. But the prints were all wrong. Too long, for one thing, with fingers that stretched impossibly far, only 4 fingers on each hand, with the thumb positioned at an unnatural angle. Some of the prints were facing backwards, as if the palms had been pressed down from impossible directions. When I touched one of the prints, trying to convince myself it might be from some animal I wasn't familiar with, a greasy residue came off on my fingers. It wouldn't wash off with water from my bottles, wouldn't rub off on my clothes or sleeping bag. My fingertips stayed slick and faintly smelly for hours, like I'd touched something that had been dead too long. The daylight helped a little. Everything always seems less threatening in sunshine, and I managed to convince myself that maybe I was dealing with some local kids playing elaborate pranks on solo campers. It wasn't a great explanation, what kids would be wandering around the deep woods at night making handprints, but it was better than the alternatives my imagination was supplying. I spent most of that 3rd day hiking deeper into the forest, partly to clear my head and partly to see if I could find any other signs of whoever was messing with me. What I found instead made everything worse. More stone cairns, scattered throughout the woods like waymarkers. These were older than the ones around my camp, covered with moss and lichen, some half fallen from years of weather. But they all had the same basic structure, carefully balanced stones with objects placed on top. As I got deeper into the forest, the objects got stranger. Not just bones and bark anymore, but pieces of metal that looked like they'd been cut from cars or farm equipment, lengths of rope with complex knots, photographs so faded and water-damaged I couldn't make out what they showed. Some of the cairns had symbols carved into the stones themselves. Triangles within triangles, spirals that hurt to look at too long, stick figures that seemed to be climbing or reaching toward something above them. The symbols looked ancient, weathered by decades of rain and snow, but some sections seemed fresher, like someone was still maintaining them, adding new marks to old stones. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with pranksters or even modern weirdos. I'd wandered into something's territory, something that had been marking this forest for a very long time. The cairns weren't random art, they were boundary markers, territorial claims, maybe even warnings. And I'd set up my tent right in the middle of whatever ancient system I was looking at. I should have packed up and left immediately, should have loaded my Honda and driven straight back to Sarah's couch and the mess of my human problems. Instead, I hiked back to my campsite and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. After all, nothing had actually threatened me. Weird things had happened, sure, but no one had tried to hurt me. Maybe whatever was out there was just curious about an unexpected visitor. That night, they called my name. Ashley. The voice drifted out of the dark forest around 10 o'clock, clear and unmistakable. Ashley. It sounded exactly like Marcus. Same inflection, same slight southern accent he'd picked up from his grandfather. For a wild moment, I thought he'd somehow tracked me down, followed me into the mountains to continue our fight, or maybe to apologize. "Who's there?" I called back, stepping out of my tent with the flashlight. "Ashley." This time, the voice sounded like my mother, with that particular worried tone she used when she thought I was making bad decisions. But my mother was 3 states away and had no idea where I'd gone camping. Then it was Sarah's voice, laughing the way she did when she'd had too much wine. Then my coworker Jenny from the vet clinic. Then my little sister Emma, even though Emma lived in California and hadn't called me in months. Perfect copies of voices I knew by heart, but all with something wrong underneath them, like an echo of an echo. Whatever was out there was cycling through every important voice in my life, trying them on like masks, to see which one would make me come into the dark. I stayed by my fire, knife in hand, calling back questions that never got answered. The voices kept coming for hours. Friends, family, coworkers, even my high school English teacher, all calling my name from different directions in the woods. Around midnight, I saw them. They moved between the trees like pale shadows, just visible at the edge of my firelight, tall, much taller than any person should be, with skin that looked gray and stretched too tight over their bones. Their arms hung down almost to their knees, swaying as they walked, and their heads were tilted at angles that would have broken a human neck. There were at least 6 of them that I could count, maybe more, lurking further back in the darkness. They moved in perfect coordination, without making any sound I could hear, like they were communicating in ways I couldn't detect. Studying my campsite from different angles, taking turns, stepping closer to the edge of my firelight before melting back into the shadows. They were beautiful in a terrible way, like something carved from white marble and left out in the weather too long. Beautiful and completely, fundamentally wrong. One of them stepped fully into the circle of my firelight. 8 feet tall, at least, with eyes too wide for its face and skin that had a waxy texture, like old candles left in the heat. When it moved, its joints bent in ways that suggested extra bones, or bones that curved differently than they should. It raised one impossibly long arm and pointed directly at me with a finger that seemed to go on forever. Then it pointed at the ground at my feet. The meaning was unmistakable. It was claiming me, marking me as part of whatever collection the cairns represented. I grabbed my keys and ran. I'd like to say I made some brave stand or clever escape, but the truth is, I bolted like a spooked deer. Left everything, tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, all of it, and sprinted through the dark woods toward where I'd left my car. Branches tore at my clothes and face, roots tried to trip me, but I didn't slow down until I reached my Honda and locked myself inside with shaking hands. The engine turned over on the 3rd try, and I drove down that narrow dirt track faster than was safe or smart, my headlights cutting wild arcs through the darkness as the car bounced and slid on the rough ground. I didn't stop until I hit paved road, and I didn't really breathe easy until I could see the lights of Martinsburg ahead of me. I never went back for my gear. Never even drove past the turnoff for Lost River Gorge again. When people asked what happened to my camping trip, I said I'd had equipment problems and had to come back early. Only Sarah knows the real story, and only because she was the one who found me sitting in her driveway at 4 a.m, still covered in scratches and babbling about things in the woods. That was 6 months ago. I'm still in Martinsburg, still working at the vet clinic, still sleeping on Sarah's couch because I can't quite bring myself to look for my own place yet. Marcus tried to call a few weeks after I got back, probably heard through mutual friends that I'd had some kind of breakdown in the woods, but I didn't pick up. Whatever problems we'd had seemed incredibly small and manageable compared to what I'd encountered in the mountains. The weird thing is, I still hear my name called sometimes. Late at night, when I'm lying in Sarah's spare room, I'll hear it drifting in through the window, always in a voice I recognize, always someone I care about, always with that strange hollow echo underneath that means it's not really them. It's gotten to where I sleep with earplugs most nights. I think whatever was in those woods marked me somehow, the way animals mark their territory. Maybe I was always supposed to stay and join whatever collection they were building with those stone cairns. Maybe running away just delayed the inevitable. But every morning, I wake up still human, still myself, still able to tell the difference between real voices and the perfect copies that call to me from the dark. For now, that feels like enough. My name's Ryan Mitchell, and I've been driving delivery trucks through the mountains of West Virginia for 8 years. Started when I was 22, right after my dad died in a mining accident and left me with his truck payments and not much else. The furniture company in Charleston pays decent, and I actually like the solitude of long drives through places where cell towers give up and GPS starts guessing. But what happened in Canaan Valley 3 months ago? It changed everything I thought I knew about what lives in these mountains, and it cost me more than I ever imagined. The thing about deep Appalachia is that some places have been claimed longer than any deed or survey can record. Old-timers will tell you stories, if you listen, about things that moved through these hollers before the Cherokee, before anyone. But I never paid attention to that folklore until I found myself delivering furniture to families who'd bought land that wasn't really for sale. I'd been working Canaan Valley routes for about 2 years when the incident started. Rich folks from D.C. and Richmond had discovered this particular stretch of mountains and were building $500,000 rustic retreats in places their great-grandfathers would have known to avoid. The money was good, remote deliveries paid double because of the distance and difficulty. Plus, I genuinely enjoyed the drive through some of the most beautiful and isolated country in West Virginia. My supervisor, Dave, had been with the company for 15 years and knew every backwoods route in 3 counties. He'd worked Canaan Valley before and always seemed a little uncomfortable when assignments came up for that area. When he handed me the delivery schedule that Tuesday morning in September, 5 high-end deliveries over 2 days, all within a 10-mile radius, he looked like he wanted to say something but kept changing his mind. "Just keep your eyes open up there, Ryan," he finally said. "Couple of the other drivers have mentioned some weird stuff. Probably nothing. But these mountain folk can get territorial about outsiders." I figured he meant the usual stuff. Locals who didn't appreciate city people buying up their hunting grounds, maybe some property line disputes, or the occasional bear getting into garbage. I'd dealt with hostile neighbors before. What I wasn't prepared for was something that had been studying human behavior patterns and didn't approve of what it was seeing. The drive up took 3.5 hours, winding through increasingly narrow roads as elevation climbed and civilization thinned out. Past Davis, the road became a series of switchbacks, cutting through forests so thick that noon looked like twilight. My GPS started losing signal around mile marker 47, and the last cell tower I'd seen was 40 minutes behind me. This was the kind of isolation that makes you aware of how far you are from help. The first delivery was to Pine Ridge Retreat, a massive log structure that probably cost more than most houses in Charleston. The driveway was a 1/4 mile of expensive stonework that must have required a convoy of construction vehicles to install this far from any quarry. As I backed my truck up to their wraparound porch, I noticed something that should have warned me about what was coming. Every tree surrounding their property had fresh claw marks, deep, parallel gouges running vertically down the bark of oak and pine trees, each set exactly 4 marks, each mark about 6 feet long. The cuts were recent. I could see whitewood exposed and sap still bleeding from the wounds. Whatever had made them was tall enough to reach 10 feet up a tree trunk and strong enough to carve through bark like it was soft cheese. The Hendersons, a couple in their 50s from Arlington, came out to help me unload their leather sectional. They seemed nervous in a way that went beyond normal excitement about new furniture. Mrs. Henderson kept glancing toward the tree line while we maneuvered the couch through their front door, and Mr. Henderson mentioned they'd been having boundary issues. "Someone's been moving our property markers," he said as I positioned the sectional in their great room. "Professional survey stakes, GPS coordinates, the whole 9 yards. But 3 times now, we've woken up to find them relocated." I asked if they thought it was neighbors, maybe some dispute over where property lines actually ran. "That's just it," Mrs. Henderson said, lowering her voice. "We had the entire property resurveyed by the best company in the state. Cost us $12,000. But the markers keep getting moved into patterns." She showed me photos on her phone. Instead of marking property corners and boundaries, their survey stakes had been rearranged into perfect geometric shapes. Triangles, spirals, even what looked like astronomical configurations. The stakes hadn't been damaged or destroyed, just carefully extracted and repositioned with mathematical precision. "Each time, they form different patterns," Mr. Henderson added, "like something's trying to communicate through surveying equipment. I finished the delivery and headed deeper into the valley, but those claw marks stayed with me. Whatever had scraped those trees wasn't doing random territorial marking. The cuts were too uniform, too deliberately spaced. Each tree had been marked at exactly the same height, with identical spacing between claw marks. It looked almost systematic. The second delivery was to a family named the Kowalskis, who'd moved up from Virginia Beach to build their dream retirement home. They were waiting for me in their driveway, and I could tell immediately that they were scared. Really scared. "Thank God you made it," Mrs. Kowalski said before I'd even turned off the engine. "We weren't sure anyone would come after what happened to the UPS driver." I asked what she meant while unloading their custom dining set, table chairs, and matching hutch that had cost more than my truck. "Yesterday morning, Marcus Stubb, that's the UPS guy, came to deliver a package. Normal delivery, nothing unusual. But when he got back to his truck, it was surrounded." Mr. Kowalski led me around to their backyard while his wife continued the story. "Rocks," she said. "Hundreds of them, arranged in perfect concentric circles around his vehicle. Each circle was exactly 3 feet from the next one, each rock spaced exactly 18 inches apart. Mathematical precision. They showed me photos of the stone circles, 7 perfect rings radiating out from where the UPS truck had been parked, with Marcus's vehicle trapped in the center like some kind of ritual sacrifice. The rocks weren't random river stones. They were uniform in size, each about the diameter of a softball, each positioned with surveyor-level accuracy. "Marcus called the sheriff," Mr. Kowalski said. "Took them 2 hours to respond way out here. By the time Deputy Morrison arrived, Marcus had cleared enough rocks to drive out, but he was shaking so bad he could barely hold his clipboard." While I assembled their dining room furniture, the Kowalskis told me about their own experiences. Their property had a split-rail fence running along the back boundary, marking where their land ended and national forest began. 3 times in the past month, something had been systematically removing fence posts and rearranging them. "Not damaging them," Mrs. Kowalski emphasized. "Carefully extracting them from concrete foundations and repositioning them into patterns. Spirals, mazes, geometric configurations that would take an engineer to plan." She showed me photos of their fence posts arranged in elaborate designs, perfect spirals that drew your eye into the center, maze-like configurations that seemed to shift when you stared at them too long. Mathematical patterns that suggested intelligence far beyond anything you'd expect from local vandals. But what really unsettled me was what Mr. Kowalski showed me next. At the base of each repositioned fence post, pressed deep into the soft earth, were handprints, human-shaped, but easily twice normal size with only 4 fingers. The prints were so clear you could see the texture of skin, the individual ridges and lines. Whatever had left them possessed hands large enough to grip a fence post like a pencil. Between the second and third deliveries, I stopped to examine one of the relocated fence posts myself. The Kowalskis had given me permission to walk their property line, and what I found made my hands shake. The fence posts weighed at least 150 pounds each, with their concrete foundations, but they'd been lifted straight out of the ground without any digging equipment. You could see the perfect cylindrical holes where they'd been extracted. Around each hole, the earth was compressed in that same 4-fingered handprint pattern, as if something incredibly strong had simply reached down and pulled up fence posts like they were dandelions. The repositioned posts formed a pattern that hurt to look at directly. Your eyes wanted to follow the lines, but doing so created a dizzy, disorienting sensation that made my stomach turn. It was like optical illusion architecture designed to make humans feel unwelcome. Standing there in that rearranged fence line, I felt eyes on me for the first time. Not the casual awareness of being watched, but the focused attention of something studying me with predatory intensity. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line, and caught a glimpse of movement about 100 yards away. Something large had ducked behind a massive oak tree, but not quickly enough to avoid being seen. The shape was wrong. Too tall, too angular, moving with a fluid grace that didn't match any animal I knew. The third delivery was where real terror began. The Richardsons lived at the end of a dirt road that wound through dense forest for over 3 miles. No cell service, no visible neighbors, just thick woods pressing in from all sides. By the time I reached their cabin, I understood why they'd sounded so desperate on the phone. Their entire driveway had been transformed overnight. What used to be a normal gravel drive was now lined with hundreds of stones arranged in 7 perfectly parallel rows running from the main road to their front door. Each stone was positioned exactly 18 inches from its neighbors, creating corridors just wide enough for a person to walk through but too narrow for any vehicle. It happened Sunday night, Mr. Richardson explained, as we hand-carried pieces of their bedroom set through the stone corridors. We went to bed with a regular driveway. Monday morning, The precision was unsettling. Each stone was identical in size, each positioned with mathematical accuracy. But what made it truly terrifying was the realization that this had been done silently. The Richardsons had heard nothing during the night, no vehicles, no voices, no sounds of hundreds of rocks being positioned by hand. We tried removing some of them Monday evening, Mrs. Richardson said. Thought if we cleared a path, we could at least get our car out. Tuesday morning, every stone we'd moved was back in its exact original position. Plus, they'd added 3 more rows. Their dog, a German shepherd named Duke, who normally barked at everything from squirrels to falling leaves, had been completely silent both nights. When I asked to see the dog, they led me to their back porch, where Duke was lying under a table, shaking uncontrollably. The animal wouldn't come out, wouldn't make eye contact, wouldn't stop trembling. He's been like this since Monday morning, Mr. Richardson said. Vet says there's nothing physically wrong with him, but he won't go outside. Won't even look toward the woods. As I was loading empty dollies back into my truck, I felt that predatory attention again, stronger this time. The sensation was so intense it made my skin crawl and my heart race. I kept checking my mirrors, scanning the forest around the property, and finally caught sight of what had been watching me. About 50 yards back in the trees, something tall and gray was keeping pace with my movements. When I stopped to get a better look, it would freeze completely still, blending into the shadows between tree trunks. But when I continued working, it would resume its methodical observation. I was being studied, cataloged, evaluated, and I didn't think I was passing whatever test was being administered. The drive to the 4th delivery was when I realized how much trouble I was in. The thing, I could no longer pretend it was human, was following my truck through the forest, staying parallel to the road about 100 yards out, matching my speed perfectly. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I accelerated, it kept pace. But it was moving through dense woodland, over terrain that should have been impossible to navigate at vehicle speeds. I stopped the truck twice to try getting a clear view, but both times the creature froze so perfectly still that I couldn't distinguish it from the trees and shadows. Only when I resumed driving would I catch glimpses of that tall gray form moving through the forest like it was open ground. By the time I reached the 4th delivery, I was seriously considering abandoning the route and driving straight back to Charleston. But the Garcia family was waiting for me, and they weren't alone. 2 other delivery vehicles were parked in their driveway, a UPS truck and a Postal Service Jeep. Marcus, the UPS driver I'd heard about from the Kowalskis, was standing with Betty, an older mail carrier I'd met on other routes. Both looked shaken, and when Marcus saw my truck, he waved me over with obvious relief. "Thank God," he said. I was starting to think I was losing my mind. Turns out, all 3 of us had been experiencing escalating incidents throughout the valley. Marcus's packages were being rearranged into geometric patterns every time he made deliveries. Not stolen, not damaged, just repositioned into configurations that seemed designed to send a message. Yesterday, I delivered 6 packages to 3 different houses, Marcus explained. Standard procedure, left them where customers requested. But by evening, all 6 packages had been arranged in a perfect hexagon in one family's backyard. Each package positioned exactly the same distance from the center point. Betty's story was even more unsettling. Every morning when she started her route through Canaan Valley, she'd find her postal Jeep surrounded by stone circles, perfect rings of rocks, each ring a different diameter, all centered on her vehicle. "It's like something's learning our patterns," Betty said. "Our routes, our schedules, our procedures. But it's not trying to stop us, it's trying to improve us, like it thinks our delivery methods are inefficient." The Garcias confirmed that every delivery professional working in the valley had noticed similar incidents. UPS packages rearranged into mathematical patterns, mail vehicles surrounded by stone markers, furniture trucks followed through the forest. Something was studying human logistics and transportation systems, then providing what seemed like corrections or suggestions. Question is, Marcus said, what happens when it decides we're not learning fast enough? None of us had good answers, but we all had jobs to complete. I delivered the Garcia's Entertainment Center, a massive piece that took 2 hours to assemble, while trying to ignore the growing sensation of being evaluated by something that found our presence inadequate. The final delivery was to a cabin so remote that my GPS gave up completely about a mile before the turnoff. I had to navigate by landmarks the Washingtons had provided: a rusted mailbox, a lightning-struck oak, a creek crossing where the bridge was just 2 logs with planks laid across them. When I finally reached their driveway, I understood why they'd sounded desperate on the phone. The entrance was completely blocked by an elaborate barrier constructed from stones, fallen branches, and carefully positioned logs. But this wasn't vandalism. This was architecture. The barrier was beautiful in its complexity, with stones fitted together like ancient masonry and branches woven through gaps with artistic precision that would have impressed a museum curator. The barrier stood about 8 feet tall and completely spanned the driveway entrance. But it wasn't designed to keep people out entirely. There were gaps just wide enough for a person to walk through, positioned at intervals that suggested careful planning. Whatever had built this wanted to allow human foot traffic while preventing any motorized vehicles from reaching the cabin. The Washingtons, an elderly couple from Richmond, met me at the barrier. They'd been living in their retirement dream home for exactly 1 week, and the barrier had appeared the night after they moved in. "We called everyone," Mr. Washington said. "County Road Department said it's not on public land, so not their problem. Sheriff's Department said probably kids, but look at this craftsmanship. Kids didn't build this." We had to hand carry their bedroom furniture through the gaps in the barrier, piece by piece. It took 3 times longer than normal, and the whole time I felt like we were being observed from the forest around us. Not just watched, studied with scientific intensity, like lab animals being evaluated for behavioral responses. As I was loading my empty dollies back onto the truck, I saw it clearly for the first time. The creature was standing about 30 yards away, partially concealed behind a massive oak tree, but visible enough that I could make out its full form. It was easily 12 feet tall, with grayish-brown skin that looked like tree bark. Its proportions were almost human, but stretched vertically, like someone had taken a normal person and pulled them upward by 4 feet. The arms were too long, the torso too narrow, the head slightly too large for the elongated frame. But what terrified me most was what it was doing. The creature was placing stones with surgical precision, building what looked like an extension to the barrier. Its movements were deliberate and calculated, each stone positioned according to some mathematical plan I couldn't comprehend. This wasn't random territorial marking, this was intelligent engineering with a specific architectural purpose. When it noticed me watching, the creature stopped working and turned to face me directly. We maintained eye contact for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, and I got the clear impression that it was disappointed in what it saw. Like a teacher evaluating a student who hadn't learned the lesson. The creature's eyes were large and dark, with an intelligence that was unmistakably ancient. This thing had been here long before humans arrived, had watched us spread through these mountains, had studied our behavior patterns and found them inadequate, wasteful, chaotic. It raised one of those oversized 4-fingered hands, each finger easily twice the length of human digits, and pointed deliberately toward the valley entrance. The gesture was unmistakably clear. Humans weren't welcome here permanently. We could visit, make deliveries, conduct necessary business, but attempts at permanent settlement would be systematically discouraged through increasingly elaborate territorial corrections. Then the creature did something that made my blood freeze. It smiled. Not a human smile, but an expression of satisfaction that suggested it had been waiting for this moment of direct communication. Like it was pleased that I'd finally understood the lesson being taught through rearranged property markers, relocated fence posts, and architectural barriers. The message was clear. This territory belonged to something that had been here far longer than any human deed or survey could record. Something patient enough to study our patterns for months before implementing systematic corrections designed to guide human behavior toward more appropriate boundaries. I loaded my truck and drove out of Canaan Valley as quickly as the mountain roads allowed, but I couldn't stop thinking about that ancient intelligence, evaluating human settlement patterns and finding them unacceptable. This wasn't some random creature causing problems for property owners. This was something that understood architecture, mathematics, logistics, and territorial management better than any human engineer. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that I'd misinterpreted what I'd seen. But then the calls started coming in. Other delivery drivers throughout eastern West Virginia were reporting similar incidents. Property markers being relocated into geometric patterns, fence posts rearranged into elaborate configurations, delivery routes being corrected through stone circles and architectural barriers. Whatever I'd encountered in Canaan Valley wasn't isolated, it was part of something much larger. A week later, Marcus called me from the hospital. He'd been making a routine delivery to a remote cabin near Monongahela National Forest when his truck broke down. When he got out to check the engine, he found that someone had carefully removed specific bolts and wires, not randomly, but according to what seemed like an engineering schematic designed to create a temporary but repairable malfunction. While he was examining the sabotage, he heard something moving through the forest around him, something large, keeping just out of sight, but clearly studying his response to the vehicular correction. Marcus tried to radio for help, but his communications had been modified too. Someone had adjusted his radio frequency by exactly 0.3 megahertzes, not enough to completely block transmission, but enough to ensure that his calls would be received by something other than human dispatchers. "Ryan," Marcus said, his voice shaking over the phone, "something answered my radio call. Something that knew my route schedule, my cargo manifest, even my employee ID number. It suggested more efficient delivery patterns for the area. It was trying to help." The conversation lasted 17 minutes. Whatever had answered Marcus's radio call had extensive knowledge of logistics, transportation efficiency, and human settlement patterns throughout the Appalachian region. It offered specific suggestions for improving delivery routes, reducing environmental impact, and establishing what it called sustainable interaction protocols between human commercial activities and territorial boundaries that had existed for millennia. Marcus recorded part of the conversation on his phone. When he played it for me, the voice was clearly not human, too deep, with harmonic overtones that suggested vocal cords designed for a much larger throat. But the intelligence behind the voice was sophisticated enough to understand complex logistics, environmental science, and what sounded like advanced mathematical modeling. The thing had been studying us for much longer than anyone realized. It understood our transportation networks, our settlement patterns, our commercial activities, and it had decided that human expansion into its territory needed to be managed through systematic corrections designed to guide us toward more appropriate boundaries. Marcus never went back to work. The recording he made disappeared from his phone 3 days later, replaced by an audio file containing precise GPS coordinates for optimized delivery routes that avoided what the voice described as territorially sensitive areas. I tried to forget about Canaan Valley, but forgetting became impossible when families started disappearing. Not all at once, and not in ways that made headlines. The Hendersons simply stopped answering their phone. The Richardsons were found by hikers 3 weeks later, walking along a highway 30 miles from their cabin with no memory of how they'd gotten there. The Kowalskis sold their property to a buyer who turned out not to exist. The deed transfer was processed through a law firm that had been closed for 15 years. One by one, every family I delivered furniture to in Canaan Valley simply left. Not dramatically, not with complaints or police reports. They just quietly disappeared from their expensive mountain retreats, leaving behind furnished cabins that real estate companies couldn't seem to locate in their databases. I quit the delivery company 2 months later when Dave handed me another assignment for Canaan Valley. A single delivery to a cabin that, according to the address, should have been located exactly where the Richardsons used to live. "Ryan," Dave said, "customer specifically asked for you, said you delivered furniture to neighbors and knew the area." I looked at the delivery order. Customer name, R. Mitchell. Delivery address, my own apartment in Charleston. The order was for a custom-built coffin. I moved to Virginia the next day, but even here, 3 months later, I still find stone circles in my driveway some mornings. Perfect rings of rocks, each positioned with mathematical precision, all centered on my car. The message is clear. Territorial boundaries aren't limited by state lines, and some lessons require ongoing reinforcement until proper behavioral modifications are achieved. I work in a warehouse now. Indoor job, no deliveries, no remote locations. But sometimes, late at night when I'm doing inventory, I hear something moving in the spaces between the shelving units. Something large, something patient, something that understands logistics and efficiency better than any human manager. It's still studying us, still implementing corrections, still teaching lessons to humans who thought they could claim territory that was never really ours to begin with. And I'm starting to think the lessons are just beginning. My name's Sarah Collins, and I was 26 when this happened, working as a bank teller down in Charlotte. It was one of those jobs that paid the bills but didn't exactly set your soul on fire, you know? I'd been there about 3 years, dealing with the same customers every day, counting money, processing deposits. Pretty routine stuff. But I was saving up to maybe go back to school, figure out what I actually wanted to do with my life. Anyway, my cousin Emma was getting married up in Virginia, somewhere in the Blue Ridge Mountains. We'd been close growing up, but life had kind of pulled us in different directions after high school. I hadn't seen her or really any of my family in about 3 years, which is terrible when you think about it. Work, bills, excuses, you know how it goes. But when that wedding invitation came, I knew I had to be there. Emma had always been more like a sister to me than a cousin. The wedding was supposed to be in this tiny mountain town called Bramblewood. I'd never heard of it, but Emma said it was where her fiancé's family was from, real old Virginia mountain folk who'd been there for generations. She sent me directions since GPS could be spotty up in those mountains, but I figured my phone would handle it fine. Technology's pretty good these days, right? I left Charlotte early that Saturday morning, probably around 6:30. The wedding wasn't until 3 in the afternoon, but Emma had warned me the drive could take longer than expected because of all the winding mountain roads. Plus, I wanted to have time to get ready and maybe catch up with family before the ceremony. I hadn't bought a new dress in ages, but I'd found this nice blue one that Emma said would be perfect for the mountain setting. The drive started normal enough. I-77 north through Charlotte, then smaller highways as I got into the foothills. The landscape gradually changed from suburbs to farmland to those rolling hills that eventually turn into real mountains. I'd always loved that drive. There's something peaceful about watching the world get quieter and greener as you head up into the mountains. Cell phone coverage got spotty pretty quick, but that was expected. My GPS kept recalculating the route, taking me off the main highways onto smaller and smaller roads. Some of these back roads barely looked wide enough for 2 cars, winding through deep hollows where the trees created a canopy so thick it felt like driving through a tunnel. The radio started cutting in and out too, picking up strange stations that seemed to play nothing but old country music and gospel songs. I wasn't too worried about it. Mountain driving was always unpredictable, and GPS systems sometimes took you on weird routes to avoid traffic or construction. I had Emma's written directions as backup, though they weren't much help since they referenced landmarks I couldn't identify. Turn left after the old mill, right at the church with the blue roof, that kind of thing. I figured I'd recognize them when I saw them. Around 10 in the morning, I started seeing road signs for a place called Millerville. It wasn't on Emma's directions, but the signs made it look like a decent-sized town, so I figured I could stop there and ask for directions to Bramblewood if needed. Maybe grab some coffee and stretch my legs. The first thing I noticed when I drove into Millerville was how clean and well-maintained everything looked. The main street was lined with these beautiful old buildings, a pharmacy with hand-painted signs, a 5 and dime store, a movie theater with one of those classic marquees. Everything looked like it had been perfectly preserved from decades ago, like one of those historical downtown renovation projects you see sometimes. But what really caught my attention were the cars. Every single vehicle I saw was vintage. We're talking 1,940 Fords 1,950, Chevrolets, even some older models I couldn't identify. And they weren't just restored classics sitting in a car show. People were actually driving them, using them like everyday vehicles. They were all in perfect condition too, with chrome that gleamed and paint jobs that looked fresh off the assembly line. I pulled into a gas station that looked like something out of an old movie. The pumps were those tall, rounded ones with the glass tops, and there was an attendant who came right out to help me. He was an older guy, maybe in his 60s, wearing coveralls and a cap that said, "Millerville Service." "Good morning, miss," he said with a smile. "Fill her up?" I was so surprised by the full-service treatment that I just nodded. Nobody pumps your gas for you anymore, especially not in small towns. While he filled the tank, he cleaned my windshield with a squeegee and even checked my oil level. "That'll be $4.50, he said when he finished. I stared at him. $4.50 for a full tank? He looked puzzled. "Yes, miss. Premium's a nickel more, if you prefer." I handed him a 20, figuring he'd made some kind of mistake. But when he saw the bill, his expression got really strange. This is different money," he said, holding it up to the light. "New style. Where'd you get this?" "What do you mean? It's just a $20 bill." He studied it for a long moment, then shrugged and went into the station. He came back with my change. Actual coins and small bills that looked older than anything I'd seen outside of a museum. "You passing through from up north?" he asked. "We don't see many tourists with the new style money." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just thanked him and got back in my car. Looking around the town more carefully, I started noticing other weird details. All the people I could see were dressed in what looked like vintage clothing, but it wasn't costumey or theatrical. It was just normal clothes that happened to look like they were from 50 years ago. Women in house dresses and men in suspenders and work shirts. The businesses all had that same old-fashioned look too. Hand-painted signs, vintage advertisements in the windows, prices that seemed ridiculously low. A diner had a sign advertising Blue Plate Special, 75 cents, and the movie theater was showing something called The Best Years of Our Lives for a quarter admission. I tried to use my phone to look up information about Millerville, but I had no signal. My GPS was completely confused too. It kept showing my location as somewhere in the middle of nowhere, with no roads or towns marked anywhere nearby. According to my phone, I was driving through empty wilderness, but I was clearly in a real town, with real people and businesses. So I decided to stop at the diner and ask for directions to Bramblewood. Maybe someone local could help me figure out where I was and how to get back on track. The diner was called Mel's Place and had that classic railroad car look, all stainless steel and red vinyl booths. When I walked in, the whole place went quiet. Every person in there, and it was pretty full, turned to stare at me. I looked down at my clothes, wondering if I had a stain or something, but I was just wearing jeans and a sweater, nothing too unusual. A waitress with her hair in victory rolls came over with a coffee pot. "You can sit anywhere, hun," she said, but her voice was careful, like she was talking to someone unpredictable. I sat at a booth and she poured me coffee without asking. The cup was one of those heavy white ceramic ones you see in old diners, and the coffee was stronger than anything I was used to. "I'm trying to get to Bramblewood," I said. "For a wedding. Do you know how to get there from here?" She frowned. "Bramblewood? Never heard of it. You sure that's the right name?" "Pretty sure. It's supposed to be up in the mountains somewhere." "Well, the mountain roads can be tricky," she said. "Sometimes they take you places you weren't expecting to go." "How'd you end up in Millerville?" "My GPS brought me here, though now it's acting like this place doesn't exist." She gave me a look I couldn't quite read. "GPS? That's some kind of new navigation system?" I pulled out my phone to show her, but she just stared at it like she'd never seen anything like it before. That's a telephone?" she asked. "It's a smartphone, you know, makes calls, internet, maps, everything." The conversation was getting stranger by the minute. I looked around the diner again and noticed more details that seemed off. The jukebox in the corner was playing songs that sounded familiar but not quite right, like covers of songs I knew, but older versions. The newspapers stacked by the register had headlines about post-war reconstruction and something about President Truman. "What year is it?" I asked, feeling ridiculous. The waitress looked at me with genuine concern now. "It's 1947, honey. October 18th, 1947. Are you feeling all right? You're not one of those time travelers from up the mountain, are you?" My hands started shaking. I looked at the calendar on the wall behind the cash register, and it clearly showed October 1947. But that was impossible. It was 2024. I had driven here from Charlotte this morning in my 2019 Honda Civic. I had a job and an apartment and a wedding to get to. "I need to go," I said, standing up quickly. "Thank you for the coffee." I left money on the table, my strange new style money, and hurried out of the diner. Back in my car, I tried to drive out of town, but something impossible happened. Every road I took, no matter which direction I went, led me right back to Main Street. I'd drive for 10 or 15 minutes through what looked like open countryside, following clear roads with proper signage, but I'd always end up back at that same gas station. After the fourth try, I was starting to panic. I parked in front of what looked like a library and went inside, hoping to find some kind of explanation for what was happening to me. The librarian was a woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked up when I came in and smiled warmly. "Can I help you find something, dear?" "I'm looking for information about Millerville," I said. "About the area, the history, anything that might explain." I trailed off, not sure how to explain what I was experiencing. "Of course," she said. "Are you doing research for school?" She led me to a section with local history books and newspapers. Everything was dated 1947 or earlier. I picked up a newspaper from that morning, the 18th of October 1947, and the headlines were about veterans returning from World War II, the beginning of the Marshall Plan, and local news about harvest festivals and town meetings. "This is going to sound crazy," I said, "but I think I'm from the future, from 2024, and I'm trapped here somehow." The librarian didn't look surprised. She studied my face carefully and nodded. "You're not the first," she said quietly. "The mountain roads, they sometimes do strange things to people, especially people who are traveling with heavy hearts or minds full of worry." "What do you mean?" She led me to a quieter corner of the library and sat down across from me. "There are others here who came from different times," she said. "A soldier from the Civil War who was trying to get home to his family. A young woman from the 1962nd who was running away from troubles. A businessman from the 1992nd who was driving to his father's funeral. They all ended up here, in Millerville, in 1947. That's impossible." "Is it? You're here, aren't you? And I'm guessing you weren't exactly happy when you started your drive this morning." She was right. I had been upset about missing so much time with my family, about feeling stuck in a job I hated, about being 26 and feeling like my life wasn't really going anywhere. The wedding invitation had made me realize how disconnected I'd become from the people who mattered to me. How long have they been here? The other people from different times? Time moves differently for everyone. The soldier thinks he's been here for a few days, but by his calendar, it's been over 80 years. The businessman believes it's been a few months, but for him, it's been decades. You see, this place, it exists outside of normal time. You age normally, but the town stays the same. I felt like I was going to be sick. "How do I get out?" "I don't know if you can," she said gently. "The people who stay too long, they start to forget where they came from. They begin to accept this as their real life, their real time. Their memories of before start feeling like dreams." That afternoon, I met the other trapped visitors. There was Daniel, a Confederate soldier who'd been trying to get home to North Carolina after the war ended. There was Linda, a hippie girl who'd been driving to San Francisco in 1967 when her VW van broke down in these mountains. And there was Robert, a businessman from 1995, who'd been driving to his father's funeral when he'd somehow ended up here. We all had the same story. We'd been traveling through emotional turmoil, the roads had led us to Millerville, and now we couldn't leave. The town was like a collection point for lost souls from different eras. Daniel had been here the longest, though he still thought it was 1863. He worked at the general store and seemed perfectly content. But when I talked to him about his life before Millerville, his memories were fuzzy and disconnected. "I had a wife," he said uncertainly, "and children, I think, but it's hard to remember their faces now. This feels more real." That terrified me. I could already feel it starting to happen. My memories of Charlotte, of my job, of my life in 2024, they were beginning to feel distant and dreamlike. Meanwhile, Millerville felt more solid and real every hour I spent there. The librarian told me more about the town's history. In 1835, the government had forced Cherokee families from their ancestral lands in this valley. There had been a shaman among them, an old man who'd watched soldiers burn his family's home and march his people away at gunpoint. As he was dying, he'd placed a curse on the valley. that it would trap outsiders in the same way his people had been trapped and displaced. The town existed to teach people about loss and disconnection, about what it felt like to be pulled away from everything familiar. Anyone passing through during a time of emotional distress gets pulled in, she explained. The stronger your pain about being separated from loved ones, the more likely you are to be caught. I realized that's exactly what had happened to me. I'd been driving to reconnect with family I'd lost touch with, feeling guilty and sad about the years I'd wasted, avoiding the people who loved me. The curse had latched onto those feelings. But understanding the curse also gave me an idea. That evening, I gathered all the trapped visitors together and asked them to tell me about the people they loved, really loved, from their original times. I shared stories about Emma, about our childhood together, about how much I missed her and wanted to be at her wedding. Daniel talked about his wife Mary and their 2 young children. Linda told us about her boyfriend back in California and the life they'd planned together. Robert spoke about his father and all the things they'd never said to each other. As we shared these stories, something strange started happening. The town began to flicker, like a TV with bad reception. For moments at a time, I could see different versions of the same space. Sometimes 1,947, sometimes 1,863, sometimes 1,967, sometimes 1,995, and sometimes even 2024. The emotional energy of our connections to people we loved was weakening the Cherokee binding that held us in the town. The curse was designed to isolate people, but by sharing our love for others, we were breaking its power. "We have to go now," I said, as the reality around us continued to shift and waver. All of us, together. We ran to our vehicles. Daniel had a horse he'd arrived with, Linda had her VW van, Robert had his 1995 sedan, and I had my Honda. As the town flickered between time periods, we all drove out together, maintaining our focus on the people we loved and missed. The roads that had been leading us in circles suddenly opened up into normal mountain highways. I followed my original GPS directions and made it to Bramblewood just as the wedding was starting. Emma looked beautiful in her dress, and when she saw me, she burst into tears. "Sarah, I was so worried when you didn't answer your phone. We thought you might have gotten lost." I hugged her tight, feeling more grateful than I'd ever felt in my life, to see a familiar face, to be back in my own time, to be surrounded by people who knew and loved me. I never told anyone about Millerville. When I tried to look it up later, there was no record of any town by that name in that area. My GPS showed no roads where I remembered driving, just empty wilderness. But sometimes, late at night, I dream I'm still there. I dream about the diner and the gas station, and that clean main street with all its vintage cars. In the dreams, it feels more real than my bank job, more solid than my apartment in Charlotte. I quit that job 6 months later and moved back closer to my family. I see Emma regularly now, and I never let work or excuses keep me away from the people I care about. Because I learned something in that strange place outside of time. The connections we have with the people we love are the only things that really anchor us to our lives, to our own time, to who we're supposed to be. Sometimes I wonder about Daniel and Linda and Robert, whether they made it back to their own times or if they're still driving those mountain roads, looking for their way home. But mostly, I just try to stay connected to the people who matter, because I never want to be that lost and lonely again. The mountains are still beautiful, and I still drive through them sometimes when I visit family. But I'm always careful to travel with a light heart now, thinking about the people I'm going to see rather than the things I'm running from. Because somewhere up in those hills, there's still a place that collects lost souls, and I never want to find myself on that road again. I'm Marcus Thompson, and I was 28 when this happened, working as a postal worker in southern West Virginia. I'd been delivering mail to all the little mountain towns around there for about 3 years, places like Bluefield, Princeton, and Bramwell. Good, steady work, and I liked driving those winding mountain roads, seeing the same folks every day, getting to know the communities. Most people don't realize how isolated some of these places can be. You've got houses tucked back in hollows, where the road barely fits one car, and towns that used to be coal boom areas, but now are just a few dozen people hanging on. Bramwell was one of those places. Used to be called the millionaire's town back when coal was king. Had more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in America around 1910. Now it's maybe 400 people. a lot of beautiful old Victorian houses, and not much else. But the folks there were always friendly when I'd come through with the mail. That's actually how I first heard about the old railroad tunnel. I was talking to this guy named Jim Caldwell, who lived in one of the restored Victorian houses right on the main street. He was retired, maybe in his 60s, and had gotten into photography as a hobby. We'd chat whenever I delivered packages to him, and he was always showing me pictures he'd taken around the area. Old coal tipples, abandoned buildings, that kind of thing. Urban exploration photography, he called it. Made some pretty striking images. One day in October, Jim mentioned this old railroad tunnel up in the hills behind Bramwell. Said it was from the 1922nd, part of the old Norfolk and Western line that used to run through there. Been sealed up for decades after some kind of accident. He wasn't sure what exactly, but said the railroad company had blocked it off with concrete barriers and just left it to nature. Perfect spot for some dramatic photos. He told me, I keep meaning to hike up there myself, but these old legs aren't what they used to be. He showed me on a topographic map where it was, about 2 miles up a dirt logging road, then maybe a quarter-mile hike through the woods. The whole idea intrigued me. I'd never really had a hobby before, just work and watching TV mostly. My girlfriend Sarah had been after me to find something I was passionate about, something besides just going through the motions every day. Photography seemed like it might be worth trying, and I had a decent camera on my phone plus an old digital camera my dad had given me years back. I figured it would make for a good day trip on my next Saturday off. Sarah was going to visit her sister in Charleston that weekend anyway, so it would give me something to do. I loaded up my Jeep Cherokee with some basic hiking gear, water, snacks, a real flashlight instead of just my phone light, and both cameras. The weather was perfect that day, mid-October, probably 65 degrees, clear skies, leaves just starting to turn. The drive up to Bramwell was beautiful, like always. These mountain roads wind through some of the most gorgeous scenery you'll ever see. Steep hills covered in oak and maple, little creeks running alongside the road, old farmhouses tucked into clearings. Once I got to Bramwell, I found the dirt road Jim had marked on the map. It was rougher than I expected, full of ruts and rocks. But the Cherokee handled it fine. After about 20 minutes of slow going, I found a spot where I could park and started hiking. The woods were thick but peaceful. Just the sound of wind in the leaves and my boots crunching on the trail. I could smell that rich, earthy scent of decomposing leaves that you get in the mountains during fall. According to Jim's directions, I just needed to follow an old deer path for about 15 minutes. I found the tunnel entrance exactly where he said it would be, though it took me a minute to spot it. The whole thing was almost completely hidden behind thick vines and overgrown brush. There were rusted metal barriers, probably put there by the railroad company decades ago, but time and weather had created gaps big enough for a person to squeeze through. The tunnel opening was bigger than I'd imagined. Jim had made it sound like some small mining tunnel, but this thing was huge, wide enough for 2 trains to pass each other, probably 12 feet high. The entrance was made of old limestone blocks, real craftsmanship, from when they built things to last. You could still see the original Norfolk and Western Railway marking carved into the stone above the opening. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was how much cooler it was, probably dropped 10 degrees as soon as I crossed from sunlight into shadow. The second thing was the smell. It wasn't just the damp, musty odor you'd expect from an old tunnel. There was something else underneath it, something sweet and cloying that I couldn't quite place. The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, perfectly straight as far as my light could reach. Old railroad ties were still there, though the actual rails had been removed long ago. Some of the ties were rotted and broken, but most seemed solid enough to walk on. I started taking pictures right away. The play of light and shadow, the stone archway, the way the tunnel seemed to disappear into blackness. For the first few hundred yards, everything felt normal. Just an abandoned tunnel with some interesting photographic opportunities. My flashlight beam seemed strong enough, and I was getting some shots I thought might actually turn out pretty decent. The air was still and quiet except for the occasional sound of water dripping somewhere ahead. But as I got deeper into the tunnel, maybe a quarter-mile in, I started noticing things that didn't quite fit. The first was what I thought might be some kind of art installation. Right there on the old railroad ties, someone had arranged small animal bones in a perfect geometric pattern. a circle with triangular shapes radiating outward. The bones were completely clean, white as fresh snow, and arranged too precisely to be natural. I figured it was probably local kids messing around, maybe some kind of goth art project. I took a few photos of it and kept walking. But over the next few hundred yards, I found more of them. Lots more. Spirals made from what looked like bird bones. Triangular arrangements of what might have been rabbit or squirrel skeletons. Symbols I didn't recognize, all laid out with mathematical precision on the old wooden ties. Some of the displays included human items mixed in with the bones. An old leather shoe, worn smooth, tarnished brass buttons, a woman's earring that looked like it was from the 1940 seconds or 50 seconds. All of it arranged like it was part of some kind of museum exhibit, except this museum was in a pitch-black tunnel in the middle of nowhere. The deeper I went, the more elaborate the arrangements became, and the more vintage the human artifacts looked. I started seeing items that had to be from the 1920 seconds or 30 seconds. Old fountain pens, pocket watch chains, pieces of jewelry with settings that hadn't been popular in decades. Everything was clean and carefully maintained, like someone was actively curating these displays. That's when I started feeling uneasy. This wasn't kids playing around. This was something else entirely, something that had been going on for a very long time. But I kept walking, partly from curiosity and partly because I'd already come so far. Sarah always said I was too stubborn for my own good. About a mile into the tunnel, I reached a place where it branched into 3 separate passages. I'd had no idea the tunnel system was that complex. The main passage continued straight ahead, but there were 2 side tunnels, one heading off to the left, one to the right. Each passage was just as large as the main tunnel, all of them disappearing into darkness beyond my flashlight's range. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide which way to go. That's when I heard the scratching sounds coming from the middle passage. At first, I thought it might be bats or some other animals that had taken up residence in the tunnel. But as I listened more carefully, the sounds were too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was like someone was scraping fingernails against stone, over and over, with a steady beat. The left passage was completely silent, not even the sound of dripping water. The right passage had strange air currents flowing through it, warm air that smelled like the same sweet, cloying odor I'd noticed at the entrance, but much stronger. I decided to investigate the scratching sounds first. Something about that rhythmic scraping was hypnotic, and I wanted to know what was making it. I headed down the middle passage, following the sound deeper into the mountain. This tunnel was different from the main line. The walls were rougher, more like natural cave formation than constructed railroad tunnel, and they were covered with symbols carved deep into the rock. Not just painted or scratched on the surface, but carved with tools, like someone had spent serious time and effort creating them. The symbols were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Some looked vaguely Native American, others seemed more like mathematical equations or geometric proofs. But as I went deeper, they looked fresher, like someone was still actively maintaining them or adding new ones. The scratching sounds were getting louder and more complex. It wasn't just one source anymore. I could hear multiple scraping sounds, all working in coordination with each other. And I realized what I was hearing wasn't fingernails on stone, it was tools being sharpened. Metal tools being scraped against rock, over and over, in a steady rhythm that echoed through the tunnel. The passage sloped downward, and after maybe 10 minutes of walking, it opened into a huge natural cavern. I could hear running water, probably an underground stream, but I couldn't see the extent of the space. My flashlight beam just disappeared into the darkness above and to the sides, but what I could see made my stomach drop. The walls of the cavern were lined with alcoves, carved niches in the rock face, each one containing a carefully arranged display of bones and human artifacts. There were hundreds of them, organized like some kind of museum or library, and I could see they were sorted chronologically. The alcoves near the entrance had items from what looked like the 1920 seconds and 30 seconds, old pocket watches, fountain pens, women's compact mirrors, men's suspenders. As I walked deeper into the cavern, the displays got more modern. 1940 seconds and 50 seconds items, then 60 seconds and 70 seconds. Near the back of the cavern, I found alcoves with things that were obviously recent. Cell phones, car keys, driver's licenses, with photos that couldn't be more than a few years old. That's when I understood what I was looking at. This wasn't some weird art project. These were trophies, collections from people who had disappeared over the decades, people who had come into this tunnel system and never come back out. I was standing there, trying to process what I was seeing, when I noticed movement in the deeper passages that branched off from the main cavern. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I saw them clearly. Pale figures moving along the walls. But they weren't walking, they were crawling, their arms and legs bent at angles that shouldn't be possible for human joints. They moved in complete silence, flowing over the rock surfaces like spiders or lizards, defying gravity in ways that made my brain hurt to watch. There were at least a dozen of them that I could see, emerging from side passages and moving with obvious purpose. They were too thin to be human, stretched out like someone had taken a person and pulled them on a medieval rack until their limbs were twice as long as they should be. The worst part was their faces, or rather, the complete absence of faces. Where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was just smooth, pale skin. But despite having no visible sensory organs, they oriented toward me with perfect accuracy, like they could sense my presence better than I could see them. They started making clicking sounds to each other, not with their mouths, since they didn't seem to have mouths, but from somewhere inside their chests. The sounds were clearly communication, coordination. I watched in horror as they began moving to cut off the passages I might use to escape. These things weren't just predators, they were intelligent hunters working as a team. I realized I had maybe 30 seconds before they finished positioning themselves. The clicking sounds were getting faster, more urgent, and some of them had started making a new noise, a high-pitched shriek like metal being scraped against metal. I ran. I dropped my camera and just ran back toward the main tunnel as fast as I could, stumbling over loose rocks and nearly falling twice on the sloping passage. Behind me, I could hear them pursuing, not footsteps, but the sound of something flowing across stone, like water or wind, but with weight behind it. The shrieking sounds were getting closer, echoing off the tunnel walls, until it felt like the noise was coming from everywhere at once. I reached the main tunnel and sprinted toward the entrance, my lungs burning and my legs cramping from the sudden exertion. I could feel something grab at my backpack, just as I saw sunlight ahead. I tore the straps loose and kept running, not daring to look back until I was completely out of the tunnel and standing in the afternoon sun. I made it to my Jeep in record time, threw everything in the back, and drove straight to the Bramwell Police Department. I tried to explain what I'd found, but I could tell from the officer's expression that he thought I was either lying or having some kind of breakdown. They did send someone up to check the tunnel the next day, but according to their report, they found it completely empty. No bone arrangements, no artifacts, no alcoves carved in the walls, just an abandoned railroad tunnel with some old ties and a lot of dust. I never went back. I moved to a different postal route within a month, and Sarah and I ended up relocating to North Carolina the following spring. I told her it was for better job opportunities, but really, I just needed to get away from those mountains. Sometimes I wonder if those things are still down there, still collecting trophies from anyone unlucky enough to wander into their territory. I hope the tunnel stays sealed, but I know it doesn't really matter. They've been there since at least the 1,920 seconds, maybe longer. A few metal barriers aren't going to keep them contained forever. I never did take up photography as a hobby. My name's Rebecca Johnson, and I'm 24 years old. I've been cutting hair at a salon in Pittsburgh for about 3 years now. Nothing too fancy, just a regular place where working folks come to get cleaned up. I grew up in this tiny town called Centralia Hollow in Pennsylvania, but I hadn't been back home in 6 years. There wasn't much reason to go back, honestly. The place was pretty much dying when I left for college, and from what I heard, it had only gotten worse. But when my grandmother passed away last month, I didn't really have a choice. She was the last family I had left there, and someone needed to handle her affairs. I thought I'd drive down for the funeral, spend a week getting the house ready to sell, then get back to my normal life. I had no idea I was walking into something that would change what I understood about life, death, and family forever. The drive down to Centralia Hollow took me through some beautiful country, all rolling hills and old farm towns. But as I got closer to home, I started noticing things that made my skin crawl. There were dead birds scattered along the roadside, not just one or two, but dozens of them. Their feathers looked singed, like they'd flown too close to something hot. The trees near town had this weird, stunted look to them, with bark that was blackened in strange patterns. Even the air smelled wrong, not just the sulfur I remembered from childhood visits, but something else underneath it, something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in a hot car. When I finally pulled into what used to be the main drag, I could count maybe 8 houses still standing where there used to be dozens. But what really got to me were the empty lots. They weren't just empty. The ground was scarred in perfect rectangles where houses used to be, and steam was rising from some of them like open graves. I parked in front of grandmother's house and immediately felt heat radiating up through my car's floor. The temperature gauge on my dashboard was reading 85 degrees outside, but it felt like walking on hot coals. The thing about Centralia Hollow that most people don't understand is that we've been sitting on top of hell for over 60 years. The coal seam fire started in 1962, supposedly an accident, but the old-timers always whispered about other things. About mine foremen who cut corners and sealed workers into collapsing tunnels to save money. About accidents that weren't really accidents. About the fire being punishment for something deeper and darker than anyone wanted to admit. Most families took government buyouts in the 80s and 90s, but my grandmother was stubborn. She refused to leave, even when the ground started cracking and glowing orange at night. I grabbed my suitcase and walked up to the front door, and that's when I noticed the first really wrong thing. Grandmother's rose bushes, which she'd tended for 40 years, were still blooming. But the roses were black, not dead, actually blooming, with full, healthy petals that were the color of charcoal. When I touched one, it felt warm and left a smear of something oily on my fingers that smelled like burnt hair. Inside, the house was exactly as I remembered, except for the temperature. It had to be 90 degrees in there, and the thermostat wasn't even on. Family photos lined the hallway, but some of them looked different than I remembered. In the old picture of my grandfather's mining crew, there seemed to be more men standing in the back row than before, and their faces looked hungry. Not smiling, just hungry, with eyes that seemed to track me as I walked past. That first night, I made myself some dinner and tried to settle in. The floorboards creaked constantly, but not like an old house settling. It sounded like footsteps, deliberate and heavy, pacing back and forth beneath my feet. Around 10 o'clock, I heard the first voices. They were coming from the basement, which had been sealed with concrete for 20 years. But these weren't just conversations. I could hear screaming. Not scared screaming, but the kind of raw, throat-tearing screams that happen when someone is being hurt very, very badly. I crept down to the basement door, which was bolted shut with a metal plate welded over it. But I could hear them clear as day through 6 inches of concrete and steel. Men begging, children crying, and underneath it all, a sound like meat being torn apart by hand. The screaming would go on for maybe 5 minutes, then stop suddenly, like someone had flipped a switch. Then I'd hear laughter, cold, satisfied laughter that made my teeth ache. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear my name being called from below. Not the friendly calling I'd expect from dead relatives. This was commanding, demanding. "Rebecca, come down here, girl. Come see what we've been saving for you." The next morning, I drove over to see Mrs. Patterson, one of the few neighbors still hanging on. She was in her 80s and had lived in Centralia Hollow her whole life. When I told her about the voices and the screaming, her face went completely white. "You need to leave," she said, not even inviting me inside. "Right now, today. Don't spend another night in that house." But when I pressed her for details, the story she told me was nothing like the friendly ghost town I'd been imagining. According to Mrs. Patterson, the underground community wasn't just dead miners living peacefully in the coal fire. It was something much worse. "That fire isn't natural," she whispered, looking around like someone might be listening. "It started the day after the mine collapse of '61. 17 men died down there, including your grandfather. But they didn't die clean. The foreman, Carl Brennan, he knew the tunnel was unsafe. Sent them down anyway because the company was behind quota. When it collapsed, he told the rescue teams it was too dangerous to dig them out, sealed them in alive. She told me how the trapped miners had survived for weeks, maybe months, eating rats and drinking seepage water, how their families could hear them pounding on the rocks, begging to be saved. How the pounding had gradually changed to screaming, then to something that didn't sound human anymore. And how, when the coal fire started exactly 1 year later, the sounds from underground had gotten worse, not better. "They're not at peace down there, honey," Mrs. Patterson said. "They're angry, and they've been getting stronger every year the fire burns. They don't want to give you eternal life, they want to drag you down with them." That second night, the voices were different, more urgent, more angry. Instead of calling my name, they were issuing commands. "Open the door, Rebecca. Break the seal. Let us up." And underneath the voices, I could hear something that made my stomach turn, the sound of digging, like dozens of people clawing at concrete and stone with their bare hands. I went down to check the basement seal, and what I found made me understand why Mrs. Patterson had looked so scared. The metal plate over the door was bulging outward. Not cracked or bent, bulging, like something with enormous strength was pushing against it from the other side. The concrete around the edges was crumbling, and through the gaps I could see a red glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. And there was a smell coming through those cracks that I'll never forget. It was the smell of burned flesh mixed with coal smoke and something else, something that reminded me of the back room of a butcher shop on a hot day. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in the living room with a baseball bat, listening to the sounds coming from below. The digging was getting louder, more frantic. And then, around 3 in the morning, I heard my grandfather's voice for the first time. But it wasn't the warm, welcoming voice I'd been expecting. "Rebecca," he said, and his voice was wrong in every way possible. It sounded like he was talking through a mouthful of gravel and blood. "You look just like your mother did when she was your age. Pretty little thing. We've been watching you through the cracks, honey, watching you sleep." That's when I realized they could see me. Somehow, through all that concrete and steel, they could see everything I was doing. I looked down at the living room floor and noticed for the first time that there were small holes between the floorboards. Not big enough to put your finger through, but big enough for something to look up. "Don't be scared, girl," came another voice, one I didn't recognize. It had a wet, gurgling quality, like someone talking underwater. "We just want to show you the family business, want to show you what we've learned down here in the dark." I packed my bags right then and drove to the only motel still open in the next town over. But I couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Patterson had told me about other families, about how the underground community was getting stronger, not weaker, about how they needed living family members, but not for the reasons I'd originally thought. The next day, I did some research at the local library. What I found in the old newspaper archives made me sick to my stomach. The mine collapse hadn't been the only accident in Centralia Hollow. Over the past 60 years, there had been dozens of mysterious disappearances. Always family members of the trapped miners. Always people who came back to visit or settle affairs after a death in the family. The most recent case was only 2 years ago. A woman named Sarah Kowalski, whose great-uncle had died in the original collapse. She'd come back to settle his estate and had been found 3 weeks later in the woods, wandering naked and covered in burns. When the police questioned her, she kept insisting that her family was waiting for her underground and that she needed to bring them food. She was institutionalized and died 6 months later, but not before her medical records noted something impossible. Her body temperature never dropped below 102 degrees. Even with medication, I started to understand what was really happening. The dead miners weren't just trying to lure their relatives underground to live with them, they were feeding on them. The coal fire wasn't keeping them alive out of love, it was keeping them hungry. And every time a living family member came back to Centralia Hollow, the underground community got a little stronger, a little more capable of reaching into the world above. But I also realized I couldn't just leave, not anymore. Because on the drive back to grandmother's house, I noticed something that filled me with absolute terror. My car's temperature gauge was reading 110 degrees. But it was October, and the outside temperature shouldn't have been more than 60. The heat wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from me. Whatever those things underground had been doing while I slept in that house, whatever they'd been pumping through those cracks in the floor, it was already inside me. I could feel it in my blood, making my heart beat faster, making my skin flush hot. They weren't just calling to me anymore, they were calling through me. When I got back to the house, the basement seal had cracked completely open. The metal plate was bent backward like someone had peeled it open from the inside with superhuman strength. The hole was big enough for a person to crawl through, and that awful red glow was pouring out of it like blood from a wound. But what made me scream was what I found in the living room. There were muddy footprints leading from the basement, across the floor, and up the stairs to my bedroom. The mud was black and still warm, and it smelled like sulfur and rotting meat. Someone, or something, had been walking around the house while I was gone. That's when I heard my grandfather's voice again, but this time it was coming from upstairs. "Welcome home, Rebecca," he said, and I could hear floorboards creaking above me as he moved around. "We've got so much to show you, so much catching up to do." I knew I should have run. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of that house and never come back. But the heat in my blood was getting stronger, and with it came something I can only describe as hunger. Not for food, but for something deeper. I wanted to see them. I needed to see them. I climbed the stairs slowly, following the muddy footprints to my old bedroom. The door was open, and standing inside, with his back to me, was a man I recognized from old family photos. My grandfather, Thomas Johnson, but 60 years of burning underground had changed him. His skin was the color of charcoal, cracked and glowing faintly from within like cooling lava. When he turned around, I saw that his eyes had been replaced by small flames that danced in his skull. His mining clothes were fused to his body, melted into his flesh, and his mouth was full of what looked like broken coal instead of teeth. "You're beautiful, honey," he said, and when he smiled, sparks fell from his lips. "Just like your grandmother was when she was young, before she got so stubborn and kept you away from us." He reached out to touch my face, and I could feel the heat radiating from his hand before it made contact. When his fingers brushed my cheek, my skin blistered instantly. But I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The pain felt good in a way that terrified me. "We've been so lonely down there," he continued, leaving handprints of ash on my arms as he pulled me closer. "So hungry, and the fire, it needs feeding, needs fresh blood to keep burning strong. Your grandmother, she understood that eventually. In the end, that's when he showed me the truth about grandmother's death. She hadn't died peacefully in her sleep like the obituary said. She'd been called underground just like I was. But she was old and weak. When they tried to bring her down to the coal town, her heart had given out halfway through the tunnel, but she'd lived long enough to see what was waiting for her in the dark. She's down there with us now," grandfather said, and his voice was getting more excited, more hungry, burning, beautiful, and bright. "And she's been asking for you, honey, asking when you'll come join the family business." I wanted to ask what he meant by family business, but then he showed me. He grabbed my wrist with one of his burning hands and pulled me toward the window. When I looked out across the empty lots of Centralia Hollow, I could see them clearly for the first time. Dozens of figures moving around in the darkness, all of them glowing that same dull red. They were digging up through the ground, creating new tunnels, new ways to reach the surface. And they weren't alone. There were people with them, living people, I thought at first. But when I looked closer, I realized they were like Sarah Kowalski, family members who'd been claimed by the fire, their body temperatures raised beyond what should have been survivable, their minds slowly cooked until all they could think about was serving their dead relatives. "The fire's spreading," grandfather said with pride. "Every year, it gets a little bigger, reaches a little farther, and every year, we get stronger. Soon, we won't need to wait for family members to come to us. We'll be able to reach out and take them wherever they are." That's when I understood the real scope of what was happening in Centralia Hollow. It wasn't just about one underground community of dead miners. The coal fire was spreading beneath the entire region, and everywhere it went, it was waking up the dead. Coal miners, sure, but also everyone else who'd ever been buried in those hills. Native Americans who died in wars with settlers, Civil War soldiers, murder victims, accident victims, all of them burning underground, all of them hungry, all of them looking for living relatives to feed the fire. My grandfather led me down to the basement, where the hole in the concrete was now wide enough for a truck to drive through. The heat coming up from it was like standing in front of a blast furnace, but I found I could tolerate it now. My body was adapting, changing, preparing me for life underground. The tunnel beyond was bigger than I'd imagined, carved out of solid rock and coal, with railway tracks running down the center. But these weren't the original mine tracks. These were new, built by the dead, and they stretched off into the distance as far as I could see. Along the walls, there were alcoves carved into the rock, and in each one, I could see figures standing perfectly still, waiting. The whole mountain's hollow now, Grandfather explained as we walked deeper underground. Hundreds of miles of tunnels, connecting every cemetery, every burial ground, every place where the dead have been put to rest. And they're all awake now, honey, all awake and working together. The air got thicker and hotter as we went deeper, and the walls began to glow brighter. I could hear sounds echoing from side tunnels, machinery running, people talking, the constant scrape and clang of construction. Whatever the dead were building down there, it was massive. We finally reached the main cavern, and what I saw there will haunt me for whatever's left of my life. It was a city, a vast underground city carved out of coal and rock, with buildings that stretched up into darkness and streets laid out in perfect geometric patterns. But it wasn't built for comfort or beauty. It was built for industry. There were factories down there, powered by the coal fire, producing things I couldn't identify. Assembly lines staffed by figures that moved with mechanical precision, and everywhere, hanging from hooks and chains, were bodies in various stages of processing. Some were fresh, still pink and bleeding, others were charred and smoking, and some were just bones, picked clean and sorted into neat piles. "This is the family business," Grandfather said with obvious pride. "We've been preparing for decades, honey, getting ready for the day when we can expand operations to the surface. And you're going to help us do it." That's when he showed me the breeding program. In a section of the underground city that looked like a hospital, there were rows of beds, and in those beds were women, living women, but their body temperatures had been raised so high that their skin glowed like ember. They were pregnant, all of them, their bellies swollen enormous. But when I looked closer, I could see that what they were carrying wasn't entirely human. "The fire changes the babies," Grandfather explained. "Makes them stronger, hungrier, better adapted for the heat. And when they're born, they can survive on the surface and underground. Perfect ambassadors for our family business." The women in the beds turned to look at me when we passed, and their eyes were just empty sockets filled with flame. But they smiled at me with coal-black teeth and reached out with hands that left smoldering fingerprints on the air. "You're young and strong," Grandfather said, leading me toward an empty bed. "You'll make beautiful babies for the cause. And don't worry about being lonely. Your grandmother's here to help with the labor." That's when I saw her. Grandmother, standing beside one of the beds, but changed like all the rest. Her gray hair had burned away, leaving her scalp charred and cracked. Her house dress was fused to her skin, and her eyes were gone, replaced by small fires that danced in her skull. But she still wore her wedding ring, now melted into the flesh of her finger, and when she smiled at me, I could see traces of the woman who'd raised me. "Rebecca, honey," she said in a voice like crackling logs, "I'm so glad you finally came home. We've been preparing your room." The bed they led me to was made of black metal, heated by tubes that connected directly to the coal seam. The sheets were made of some kind of woven material that felt like steel wool, and the pillow was stuffed with what looked like human hair. When I lay down, the heat from the mattress immediately began soaking into my skin, and I could feel my body temperature climbing even higher. "Just relax, honey," Grandmother said, stroking my forehead with fingers that left glowing trails on my skin. "The first few months are always hard, but once the baby starts growing, you'll feel so much better, so much more complete." That's when I realized they weren't planning to kill me. They were planning something much worse. They were going to keep me alive, keep me conscious, while my body was slowly cooked from the inside out. While I was bred like livestock to produce children for their underground army, while my mind was gradually burned away until I became another smiling, hollow-eyed servant of the coal fire. I tried to get up, but found I couldn't move. The heat was making me dizzy and weak, and my vision was starting to blur. But I could still hear them talking around my bed, planning out the details of my new life. "She'll need to be fed regularly," someone was saying. "The high-protein diet is essential for healthy development. And we'll need to keep her temperature steady," added another voice. "Too hot and the baby won't survive. Too cool and she'll resist the process." "What about her job on the surface?" asked a third voice. "She'll need to maintain appearances until she's showing." "That's all taken care of," Grandfather said. "We've prepared a replacement, perfect down to the fingerprints. Nobody will ever know the difference. As my vision faded, I caught one last glimpse of what they'd prepared for me. Standing in the corner of the cavern was another Rebecca Johnson. She looked exactly like me, dressed in my clothes, carrying my purse. But her eyes were empty flame sockets. And when she smiled, I could see that her teeth had been replaced with polished coal. That was 6 months ago. I'm still here in the underground city, lying in this heated bed, watching my belly grow larger every day with something that kicks and scratches from the inside like it's trying to claw its way out. My skin glows faintly now, and my hair has started falling out in clumps. My teeth have loosened and begun to crack. But I'm still conscious, still aware, still able to write this down during the few minutes each day when they leave me alone. The thing inside me is almost ready to be born. I can feel it moving differently now, more purposefully, like it's learning to control my body from within. Sometimes I catch myself humming songs I've never heard before, or speaking in languages I don't recognize. And every day, my memories of the surface world get a little hazier, a little less real. The woman they sent to replace me has been doing a good job, according to the reports they bring me. She's still cutting hair at the salon in Pittsburgh, still paying my rent, still calling in sick occasionally when the heat makes it hard for her to maintain her disguise. But soon she won't need to pretend anymore. Soon, there will be enough of us on the surface to stop hiding. I can hear them building constantly, expanding the tunnels, reaching farther and farther from Centralia Hollow. Last week, they broke through into the basement of a house in Ashland. 2 weeks before that, they reached a cemetery outside Pottsville. And every time they make a new connection, more dead wake up and join the family business. The coal fire isn't dying out like the government scientists predicted. It's spreading, following old mine shafts and natural gas pockets, reaching into every corner of the Pennsylvania mountains. And everywhere it goes, the dead are waking up. Hungry, organized, ready to expand operations to include the entire surface world. If you live anywhere in coal country, you need to listen to me. Check your basements for unusual heat. Listen for sounds of digging coming from underground. Watch for family members acting strangely after visiting old mining towns. And whatever you do, don't accept any government buyouts for your property. That's how they clear the area before a major expansion. The fire is coming. The dead are coming. And they're bringing their family business with them. The thing inside me just kicked again, harder this time. I think it's almost ready to meet the world, to meet its new brothers and sisters on the surface, to help expand the family business into every town, every city, every place where the living still think they're safe from the hungry dead. I can feel my mind starting to go now, burned away a little more each day by the heat in my blood. Soon, I'll be just like grandmother and grandfather and all the rest, smiling and hollow-eyed and completely devoted to the cause. But for now, while I still can, I'm leaving this warning. The coal seam fire isn't a natural disaster. It's a recruitment tool. And if you have any family buried in these mountains, if you have any connection to the mines or the towns they've consumed, you're already on their list. They're coming for you next. And they're bringing a special kind of family reunion that you'll never forget. The heat is rising, the dead are working, and the family business is expanding. Welcome to Centralia Hollow. Please enjoy your stay. It's going to be forever.